Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me. It is a privilege to have the opportunity to speak to the leaders of the Brazilian companies that have taken innovation seriously. I just saw this fantastic presentation of all the things you're doing. I am amazed, but not surprised. It is wonderful to know that having the new opportunities, which are so enormous, you people are actually making sure you take advantage of them. In fact, I'm going to use this occasion to argue that taking full advantage of opportunities is best done by moving ahead of the game. To do that, I will talk about why understanding technological trajectories matters for success. I'm going to share with you 3 facts that are very useful for taking decisions on innovation and also for management in general. The first one you know well, but I will just remind you that technical change occurs by revolutions. Then the fact that development opportunities are a moving target, and you have to be following and making sure you know what is there and you don't miss them. I will argue that the current opportunity is of a multiple nature. So it's not just the green transition, which is very important, but we also have the current revolution and the coming revolution. So we will see a bit what that means. So technological advance seems constant, but in fact, it's not continuous. Progress in market economies has occurred in successive distinct surges of transformation, more or less every 40 to 60 years. Each defines a different paradigm, different investment and innovation opportunities, and different ways of producing and living. So major changes. There have been 5 technological revolutions in 240 years. I won't have time to discuss that this is not the 4th, but the 5th. It depends how you look at it. But if we see that the first is the Industrial Revolution, machines, factories, canals. The following one was the age of steam, coal, iron, and railways. Both of these were mainly in Britain. But then we have the third, the age of steel and heavy engineering, electrical, chemical, civil, naval, that began around the 1870s, and that was the first globalization. It was the time when it was possible to go from the southern to the northern hemisphere in just 2 weeks with steamships, to traverse the whole of the American or Asian continent in one go with transcontinental railways, where we had around the whole globe cable going transoceanic. So you could have telegrams all over the world very swiftly. And it was really the time when practically every big thing that we have, the big bridges and so on, were constructed. But especially that was the time, being the first globalization, when the Southern Hemisphere was incorporated. That included Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, Chile, and so on, and Australia and the others. So in fact, in a way, that has a lot of lessons for us as to how the changes occurred. But it was a time of major changes like we are living today. The 4th revolution was the age of the automobile, oil, petrochemicals, and mass production. We're still living the late maturity of those technologies, with rejuvenation by the new technologies and by the Chinese efforts. Then we have the current 5th revolution, the age of information technology and telecommunications, which in the view of the neo-Schumpeterians, of which I am part, is only halfway along. And finally, the future. What could the future bring? The 6th revolution is very likely to be some combination of biotech, bioelectronics, nanotech, and new materials, with some breakthrough which will make things cheap, like the microprocessor did for information revolution, or like the Ford Model T with the moving assembly line did for mass production. There's always something that opens a whole world, but it's all there, just like computers were there in the Second World War, but they really only became a revolution after the microprocessor was invented. The transistors were also there. All the elements are developing, and many companies are successful using the new technologies, but they only come together as a revolution when the previous one matures. In fact, that is what happens. Every revolution has a gestation period, 10, 20, 40, 50, maybe even 70 years before, but then the things come together. They go through a whole period of development, and finally they reach maturity and exhaustion, and everybody starts looking for new things. So an understanding of how these revolutions evolve will help us identify the changing opportunities. So because each revolution brings a change of paradigm, it not only changes what is produced, but also how it's produced. And while new industries emerge, some of the existing industries are eliminated or replaced, and many others are modernized. So it's a major overhaul of the economy. We are going through that, of course. The better we understand the nature of the changes and the opportunities it presents, the more likely it is that we will succeed. So let's look at how development opportunities move along the trajectories. So the trajectory of each revolution, as I said before, goes from eruption to maturity. So we get first a big bang connected to radical innovations, and the deployment of potential at first goes very slowly. First there is the gestation, then it goes slowly with a lot of experimenting, then it takes off, and eventually, after a few decades, reaches maturity and then survives in decline for a long time. So the early period is one of multiple experiments with new products and technologies, then successive technology systems until we get to limits to productivity, limits to innovation, saturated markets, and declining profits. So that is the time that we were living in the late 60s and 1970s, because the mass production revolution was then reaching maturity. Then the previous revolution, of course, overlaps, even though it's exhausting and declining, and the next revolution is in gestation while the other one is deploying and reaching maturity. So it is, of course, this is not mechanical. It doesn't happen exactly like that every time, nor do we know exactly how many decades it's going to take, but the general shape throughout my studies of the history of technological revolutions from the first to now, the general shape does follow this pattern. But most importantly for us, along the process, different windows of opportunity open and close. So let's see, the forms of access to the necessary knowledge change along the trajectory. So when we are in the first early period, the gestation, and in the early period of a revolution, we have relatively open access to academic and scientific research. And now that we have all the internet facilities to get access even more, and the new paradigm gradually becomes visible. So we start understanding the logic more and more, so we're able to innovate in more and more spaces. But as the revolution develops and evolves, access to knowledge, experience, and patents is increasingly closed inside the companies that have taken advantage of the beginning and have gone off with it. So it's not so easy to enter technologies that are already being developed, and they're in their strong innovation path. But then we get another moment when we can enter, which is when we have access to mature technologies from the owner companies, because it's relatively open and can be bought because it's mature. They're not so interested. They're looking for something else. They're looking for somewhere else to produce. Generally, this move to other countries or cheaper sources of materials or of labor or whatever happens when technologies go towards maturity. So obviously, different opportunities lead to different outcomes, give less or more chances. So the earlier you enter, the more independent you are to innovate, and the greater the growth ahead. The Latin American process of import substitution industrialization, including, of course, the Brazilian miracle, took advantage of the maturity phase of the mass production revolution. The major corporations were desperately looking for markets, and they were very happy to be able to have affiliates or to sell the technology to other countries. That was in the 1960s and 70s, late 60s and 70s, that happened everywhere. And of course, countries that had a large population, especially if it's not too unequal, make it possible to achieve fast growth with protection. So protectionism is a very good policy when you have a big enough market. But to make the final leap to development, you must also enter in the early phases of a revolution. The 4 Asian tigers did that. They took advantage of what I've called a double technological opportunity. What we have is the access to mature technologies of the mass production revolution, and they also had relatively open access to scientific research, the new paradigm becoming visible, and of course, the Japanese model of organization and various other things that were happening in the 70s and 80s. That was a time when there was a potential for rejuvenating the mature technologies that they had, the specific technologies that they had. So the ICT revolution was already there. They actually managed to take over the shipbuilding industry from Spain and Britain, traditional ages, but they applied the new methods and they actually made a leap. They did it in steel and other technologies, and soon they were doing memory chips because that particular sector, that particular segment of the microprocessor world, not microprocessor, sorry, of the semiconductor industry was already reaching maturity, so they could actually aim to enter. And later, of course, in a different way, that is what China has been doing. They rejuvenated the mass production revolution, and now they're entering more and more strongly in the ICT revolution. But it's very important to note that the most successful cases of transition and leaping forward, the United States and Germany from the 1870s to the First World War, that was in the third revolution that I just mentioned, Japan from the 60s, the 4 tigers, 70s, 80s, and now China, they all were strongly supported by a promoting or developmental state. This idea that the free market without support from the state can do it is illusory. There has been no case in history that has done a real leap without very strong joint action between state and industry and the private sector. Import substitution industrialization in Latin America, including, of course, the Brazilian miracle, also depended on government support, more than any, of course, because it was based on protection. But the leap depends on the nature and size of the opportunity, on the adequacy of the policies, and on the capacity of the private sector to take advantage of it. So going on with protected import substitution could never have led to a proper leap. You had to do what the 4 tigers did, to use the new technologies and the new organizational models to transform what you had in order to get to be fully competitive in the world market and to really be able to innovate throughout the whole process. It also depends the possibility of making a proper leap on having or constructing specific advantages. In some cases you have them, but dynamic advantages are about creating new possibilities, especially training people, especially high-level education. The Chinese are now sending millions of people to the West to go to the top universities because they know that that's one of the key elements of their possible success. And that has, you have to construct those advantages in one or more systems of the revolution in question. So you find the areas where everybody's going to work together so that you get synergies from different companies, not isolated companies, but actually working together and the state supporting them in all the possible ways. But of course, the question, you don't enter whole technology, you enter a system, because technological revolutions evolve as a succession of overlapping technology systems. We first had microprocessors, then software, then internet, then mobile phones, then and then iPhones, and and you go on and on. Now we have AI. Now we have it just goes one system on top of the other, like we did before with plastics, and with every technological revolution is made up of a set of overlapping systems that are interconnected, of course. But each system evolves as a succession of overlapping individual technologies. So you can enter in one corner of a system with an individual technology, and then somebody else, and then you interconnect, and then you enter the whole system, and so on. So the understanding these relationships are also important, because all of them, individual technologies and revolutionary systems, they all behave in S-curve fashion. They open similar opportunities at the early and late phases of diffusion. So you actually just enter a technology or a system in the early period or in the late period. But the stage of the revolution always matters. So that artificial intelligence is a system in its early stage, but the ICT revolution is already midway along. So that will affect the possibilities. It's possible, but not so easy to enter AI and grow to be a Google. That's why I'm saying that getting ahead of the game is one of the key conditions for success, not necessarily the only one, of course. Now let's look at the current opportunity, which is of a multiple nature. It's made up of three major factors: the current ICT revolution and its paradigm, the environmental transition as direction, and the next revolution in gestation. So we have the new AI, robotics, Internet of Things, etc. We are continuing all the shifts, and there are many still to be done, from products to services, from tangible to intangible, from standard to customized, from single to multi-purpose, from pyramids to networks, and so on. Sorry about the British spelling here. The capacity to innovate in all sectors: agriculture, materials, manufacturing, processing, and every service. So it's the whole range. ICT has changed the world in terms of markets. We're no longer thinking that it's only when you have enough capacity, and as soon as you get enough capacity, that you are fine. In fact, and that it's only manufacturing. No, the change has been broad. There is innovation in materials, there is innovation in services, and in fact, sometimes there's even more innovation in those two extremes, and in converting some manufacturing products such as films, records, books, newspapers, etc., into digital. So that's the big direction, and we still have a long way to go to finish the transformation. The ICT revolution is far from mature. Subsystems are mature, some technologies, but not the whole system, not the whole revolution. And the next revolution in gestation, it's already there. Major innovations in materials and biotechnology, the beginnings of a revolution in food and medicine, CRISPR, microbiome, mRNA, photogenetics, etc., etc., etc. New developments in agriculture and food production, including lab meat, advances in nanotech for materials and health, bioelectronics, and so on. And then we have this very important transition, which provides a direction to both revolutions, to the current one and to the future one. So we're going the shift from fossil energy to renewables. We're continuing the radical reduction of waste, materials use, and energy intensity. We have the increase in rental rather than purchase, in maintenance, obligatory maintenance now, in recycling, etc. The new emphasis on health and nutrition, forest preservation, which is very important in your case. So the three combine to make a wide-ranging, multiple opportunity space. So we don't want to disperse ourselves. Of course, there will always be one company here or there, but if we really want to make a leap in development, we need to see 1, 2, maybe 3 areas where everybody will contribute. I know this is controversial, and maybe we can discuss it afterwards, but I am thinking that in the light of those opportunities, Latin America could specialize in high-tech natural resource. That means revolutionizing the methods of production, all the processing, metallurgy, chemicals, and so on that comes afterwards, as well as the variety of products, the methods of extraction and the methods of production, meaning also agriculture, forestry, fisheries, everything that's natural. How do we exploit them? How do we use them intelligently without exaggerating, without destroying biodiversity? And of course, their customization for specific uses. And Brazil could become a world leader in green and custom materials and food, and in the corresponding capital goods and services, while continuing to serve the domestic and nearby markets for consumer goods, which can be very successful locally. But to really make a leap in development, we need to go to a space where innovation can be constant and can be frontier. But technological revolutions do not only change the what and the how of production, they also change the nature of markets, the type and organization of firms, and their interrelations. Success then will also depend on understanding and taking full advantage of those changes. What has changed in markets and innovation? From the mass production revolution to the current flexible production with the ICT revolution, markets have gone from mass market with a few custom, but basically always aiming at big volume mass market, to hyper-segmented markets, from commodities to niches in all sectors. And that means manufacturing commodities. Today, televisions are commodities, refrigerators are commodities. Even automobiles are on the verge, because they, of course, were now getting the electric vehicles and so on. But basically, there are niches in everything. There are commodities in manufacturing, and there are niches, very important, high technology niches in materials, in services, the whole thing, and customization also in practically all sectors. So we now have a much wider range of possibilities. And being industrialized actually should be called being technologized, because we're talking about a very wide range of technology uses. Where was the highest productivity before? Well, again, mostly in manufacturing. Now, high and low in the whole spectrum, from materials and agriculture to services. So it's the same thing. High and low productivity sectors. Innovation, periodic innovation, not too frequent. In fact, too much innovation was deleterious. It was bad, because mass production, you got the best, the more units you had of the same thing, that's where you get maximum productivity, lowest cost, and maximum profits. Now we're talking about continuous improvement and change, and that's what determines the profits, that's what determines the productivity, that's what determines market growth. Therefore, innovation is the main tool for the future now. How about high tech? Only big companies or little companies use low tech. Well, now we have in both big companies and in small knowledge intensive enterprises or SKIs, which more and more small high tech companies not only are growing all over the world, but they're becoming indispensable for innovation in all the other sectors. If you don't have a good enough group of software designers, if you don't have a good enough group of biotech laboratories of all sorts, things, I mean, the whole range of high-tech people that can set up very specialized, highly specialized small companies working as consultancies, as engineering services, and so on, that becomes the technical infrastructure of the economy. And therefore, not only is it important that they exist, it's very important that we promote them. So from now on, growth, survival, and competition depend on constant innovation. And development strategies, be them of companies or countries, are now innovation strategies. And I wanted to make a comment of something that's been worrying me for more than 10 years now. We continue to have separate science and technology institutions, which are fine. I mean, great that we have them, but we don't realize that we should have we should have them inside or together or something with the industry ministries, the agriculture ministries. You know, this separation makes it that we talk about a bridge. Why a bridge? It shouldn't have to be a bridge. We should be, the strategy of the country should be a science and technology strategy. The strategy of every state, the strategy of every city has to be a science and technology strategy. You can't have a strategy without science and technology today. And therefore, we shouldn't have this as if it were like, you know, and the same with education. We need to put those things together somehow. We need to innovate institutionally. And in fact, these are times for institutional innovation. That's one of the most important things that make a country successful. The Japanese MEI was crucial. Without MEI, they wouldn't have done it. So the other aspect, what has changed in organizations and relations? Okay, we know that the environment was mainly ignored in mass production. Now it's a guide for innovation. It really matters. And the more time passes, the more it's going to become a guide. Anybody who falls behind is going to stay behind because everybody, consumers and governments, are going to be pushing for environmental sustainability. We need it. We don't want to roast. So the structures, the command and control pyramids that were typical of both companies and governments, and in most cases continue to be so in governments, have to be changed now in order to function properly in this new world, in innovative, empowered networks and decentralized team structures. The agile notion has made a difference for numbers and numbers of companies. Personnel used to be seen as human resources, like natural resources, human resources. You put them together, you do this thing. Now, no. Now, employees are human capital. They're innovators. They're part of the process and therefore have to be treated as such. Inter-firm relations. It used to be that isolated firms kept their suppliers hands off. Now we have networks of collaboration with suppliers and competitors and with consumers. This asking the consumer all the time, what did you think? How do you like it? Do you like it? Do you not like it? What do you want to change? Etc. That's a form of collaboration also with consumers that used to just get before you get what you told, what you get, what we supply, and that's it. So constant innovation demands agile structures and networks with innovative personnel. While the experience of the global pandemic is moving the world from shareholder to stakeholder capitalism. So worrying about the employees, the community, the governance, the whole and the environment, of course. All these things are part of what makes a successful business now. And now the financial world is understanding it and moving more and more towards ESG companies. So who does this, the state or markets? Well, successful national products follow a similar pattern. The opportunity is more or less identified. Adequate institutions for promotion and support, increasing the technical capacity of the state, like I just mentioned, MEI in Japan, but Singapore is famous for its capacity. And so each of those countries actually developed an enormous, and this is the same case, by the way, for Germany and US in those early years that I told you about. So with this, they identify great projects or objectives, missions, a strategy, a direction, in which direction they're going to go. Things like creating an automobile industry in Japan, and so on. So for that, then, you need availability and acquisition of high management and technical capabilities, knowing exactly which ones they are. The education systems in Germany and US in the third surge, and in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, all these, Hong Kong, amazing, centered on full education, engineering education, almost fanatically worried about education, technical capabilities. technological and commercial alliances, both national and international, depending on what's needed, being open to all possibilities, and of course, sufficient funding, clear and favorable policies, and stable strategic consensus. In all those cases of success, you have stable strategic consensus that lasts for 2 decades, long term, not just every time a government changes, you change. And this has to be understood by the right, the left, the center, and everybody. If you want development, whatever your convictions, you've got to have a stable direction in which you go. In some cases, you will have more state, more this, but the whole direction has to be clear and cannot be changed with every new president. So actually, neither the state nor the market alone, but both aiming at consensus goals. Latin America, especially Brazil, could aim at a development strategy to make the leap in 2 stages, 2 steps. Now, move ahead with the multiple window of opportunity available for those countries that possess and can build upon technical capabilities, abundant natural resources, and great biodiversity. And that will make you prepared to make the leap with the next technological revolution, developing capabilities in innovative companies, local and global networks in the sectors of the future, biotech, nanotech, bioelectronics, personalized medicine, custom materials, etc., etc. That is what Asia did with the ICT revolution without planning it. They were actually assembling transistors and resistors and capacitors and all those things. They were with electronics from the beginning. They were all doing all sorts of things. They didn't know that they were going to be in this position, but they were. And it is up to this generation, it's up to you, this generation of leaders, to take that opportunity. Thank you.